All right, good afternoon, everyone. Child psychology, once again, Nadeem Sikander with the module number 20. We will be looking at, in today's module, education, schooling, learning difficulties, and high intelligence. That would be our some of our objectives that I'll share that with you. Those objectives are we'll be learning about the branch of psychology, field called educational psychology. We will also understand the history of educational psychology. We'll learn about the different perspectives of educational philosophy. And we will learn about how educational psychology approaches learning difficulties. And we will also finally look at the educational psychology, how it approaches high intelligence. So the branch of psychology that studies how people learn is called educational psychology. So the focus of this branch is to look at topics such as how students are taught, student outcomes, and different ways that students learn, and how students, when they have some of the learning disabilities, and or we'll find a little bit about how intelligence can get the most out of their educational instruction. By focusing on these topics, not only can we observe the learning process for the children and adolescents, but we can also look at the cognitive, social, and emotional process that are involved in the learning. This module gives us the overview of educational psychology. And by the end, you will be able to identify how educational psychology incorporates aspects of other type of psychology, including behavioral, developmental, and cognitive. So the history of educational psychology. So educational psychology is rather a young branch of psychology, but it has experienced much growth in the past few years. So psychology itself did not emerge as a science until the later part of the 1800s. So previously to this, educational philosophers mostly were the primary source of information. Many modern psychologists believe that the John Herbert, a philosopher, is known to be the father of educational psychology. Herbert thought that the child's interest is the topic that has an extraordinary influence on the learning outcome. So he believed that where children's interest lies is where you will find much of the influence on the learning outcome. He also believed that the teachers should always have these type of students' interest in the back of their minds when deciding what type of instructions is best for a particular student. A few years later, William James, a philosopher and psychologist, who started to make several contributions to this field of educational psychology. James published actually a textbook in 1899, Talks to Teachers on Psychology, which is considered to be the very first book on the branch of educational psychology. Around this time, Alfred Binet, the French psychologist who I mentioned in the past modules, that he developed the basic IQ testing. And Binet developed these IQ tests for the French government, and it was he wanted to identify children who have some sort of developmental delays. The goal was really for this was to create programs for special education. Meanwhile, in the U.S., we have John Dewey, who was making waves in the world of educational philosophy. His ideas were more of quite progressive ones. Dewey believed that the schools should focus on the student, not on the subjects. He also thought that the acting learning on hand, so having active learning on hand, like hands-on experience, is the most critical part of the process of learning. And by the mid-20th century, Benjamin Bloom, another educational psychologist who worked very hard and developed a taxonomy which was used to describe the categorize different objectives in education. The taxonomy had 3 domains, which were learning objectives. It also has the within those objectives that what was affective, cognitive, and psychomotor. The later in a hierarchical taxonomy, so the student's ability to master the higher level of higher level depends on having the prerequisite skills and knowledge. The intention of Bloom with this taxonomy was to motivate teachers to focus on all 3 domains, which he believed would give student a holistic educational experience. So perspectives of educational psychology, as with all other areas of psychology, research within the branch of often take a varying perspectives when considering an issue or a problem in their field. Educational psychologists often fall into one of the 3 following perspectives, and I'll share that with you. We spoke about it in the previous modules as well, but the behavioral perspective is this perspective suggests that all human behaviors are learned by the process of conditioning. So the psychologists who utilize this perspective, the behavioral perspective, will rely on the concept of operant conditioning in order to explain how learning occurs. For example, a teacher might give out tokens the students can exchange for a small toy or a chocolate, which is the reward for their behavior. Those such methods are widely used. Critics of this method, which is of the behavioral approach, complain that this perspective fails to account for things such as cognitions, attitude, and intrinsic motivation. So in a nutshell, basically, when you hand out a child, and I'm not saying you don't have to use it, it's about these are the methods being applied. And sometimes, teachers believe that whatever works, get the information across is the best method in the classroom. So giving out a student something in return of their homework completion or classwork completion or classroom participation is something that teacher rewards student for their good behavior and participation, although the critics are always saying that there's no intrinsic motivation. And I think this is somewhat something that we learn over the course of time, but I think these type of learning methods somehow are widely used in pretty much, at least in my experience in many schools, that they use this behavioral perspective to keep students motivated, even if they have to reward them with something. The next one is the developmental perspective. With this perspective, there is a focus on how children get new knowledge and skills as their brain develops, right? So we spoke about John Piaget's theories on cognitive development, which has been covered greatly throughout this course. I mean, I spoke a lot about it in the past modules. It plays an important role in the developmental perspective. Those who subscribe to developmental perspective will look at how children think during different stages of their development. Now, this helps educational psychologists to understand that the child is capable of a different times in their lives. So, different stage, different age, a child will pick up things differently. This will help educators to develop the material and teaching methods that are ideal for their specific age groups, right? So that's the developmental perspective. So even if you see the developmental perspective, that kind of gives you an idea that it has to do with the development of the children when it comes to learning. The cognitive perspective was the third one, is the perspective that had become more popular in the past couple of decades, and it takes an approach that takes into account how emotions, memories, motivations, and beliefs all contribute to the way the children learn. So that's the cognitive perspective. In cognitive psychology, that focuses on making sure the teacher understand how people learn, right? How people learn, how they remember information, how they think of information, and how they process the information that they're given, right? Not only getting the information, remembering the information, but also processing the same information that they're given. Educational psychologists who use this perspective, cognitive perspective, is in their practice are often interested in the motivation of children to learn and how they solve issues, their motivation of learning, and how they remember what they have learned, right? So that's more of a intellectual approach to how really the processing works when it comes to learning. That's the cognitive perspective. The constructivist approach is one of the most recent theories on learning, and it focuses on how children or child will construct the knowledge that they have of the world. And that's their approach. What a child knows about the world around them is it has something to do with their learning. Now, this approach tends to focus more on the cultural and social influence as a child has, and how that impacts the way they learn information. So, what they learn and their culture, their social influence are actually impacting what they're learning. This perspective actually is highly influenced by psychologist I mentioned in the previous module, Lev Vygotsky, whose work was created with an idea such as instructional scaffolding and the zone of proximal development. So that was his work in terms of a constructive approach that has to do with culture and social influence that adds to the children's learning, and that's how he believes to be the case. So these are some of those approaches that we talked about, and let's look at some of the learning difficulties and educational psychology. So learning difficulties or learning disorders refer to several learning problems. Okay, so a lack of intelligence, right? Somebody who's not smart enough or not motivated enough is not the causes of difficulties, right? Instead, the challenges are caused by the way the brain receives and processes information, okay? So that's important distinction to remember. It's not the children are not motivated enough. It's not that they're not intelligent enough. Rather, the challenge is how brain receives information and process information. So some of the most common type of learning difficulties are issues, for example, with reading, with writing, math, listening, speaking, and reasoning, for example. So now, psychologists and neurologists have been making great progress in the attempt to understand the brain. And one process that they may use is the concept of neuroplasticity. This is the ability of the brain to change, create new connections, and develop new brain cells due to the learning and experience. Now, this has led, right, to several new treatments for learning difficulties, all of which are based on notion that the brain can change, right? For example, children who have issues distinguishing, I'll give you an example, between the sound of a word, now can use a computer program that slows down the sound and allow the child or the children to understand them better. You see, so not only that, one method that was child receiving to recognize a word or a sound is now using a new tool to give the children the same information, which actually resonates with the child, is one of the example of neuroplasticity. The brain does get it. It can change. Diagnosing and testing for learning difficulties. Diagnosing learning difficulties is not always easy. Okay, and even the symptoms appear to be black and white. You may seem to see it as just clearly black and white. It is still essential that the educational psychologist evaluates a child, since obviously there are many conditions, such as ADHD, that can mask itself, right, as a learning difficulty. Even the experts will have problem diagnosing the child, and they observe the way the children think and learn. Parents who are seeking out this type of expert should speak to their doctors and perhaps the school, and so they can lead them to school psychologists and whatnot. Sometimes these professionals will work together as a team with the parent, with the teacher, and it's just the whole team being put together to overcome the learning difficulties for children. Experts recommend that parents of children who show signs of learning difficulties should research their child's problem and understand how their child learns, right? So the first thing as a parent you need to do, or a caregiver, is to understand what are the signs that your child is having learning difficulties, and you do some research on that and try to find out information that can help your children learn better, right? So this is something you can do at home. They might also want to research the services or treatments and theories that are most that goes right with the specific condition, right? Work with the children, teacher, doctor, pediatricians, and whatnot, and to find a solution and provide help. Parents should also work to nurture their child's strength, because a child may be struggling in one area, but it is quite possible that he's excelling in the other areas. So there are, I'll talk about it in future slides, there are many, many kids who fall through these education cracks that consider to be just being labeled for things that they do, and no one considers the things they're capable to do beyond the rhetoric. High intelligence and educational psychology. When most people think of educational psychological issues, they think of children who are having learning difficulties, right? That generally comes to your mind. It comes to mind that there's a educational issue, there's a problem. However, there are also issues of high intelligence. What I mean by high intelligence is the learning process in the school. So as we mentioned previously in this module, one of the most common ways to teach students is by using the concept that everyone has specific abilities at a specific age. We mentioned John Piaget's work that different ages bring different type of abilities. However, in many children with a higher intelligence, it is always the case. In some cases, these children excel scholastically, right, at a much faster rate, but their peers. But then what happens is that what occurs is that it could be a problematic in the other areas. So, when they're done with their work, for example, they're bored. Now, what they do is they start getting into other areas that are really causing problem for them, or they're not really are no longer interested in this common style or curriculum. So we'll talk about it, how we can develop and give information to children and challenge them who are on high intelligence, while teachers are working hard to make sure the struggling student can keep up. We focus on those students who can keep up. They are often unknowingly neglecting the students in the classroom who are highly intelligent. So the newest approach, the latest approach, is for educational psychologists is to come up with the way to engage these students as well, right? The higher intelligence students, because you definitely don't want to lose them, right? Just because someone is smart, you shouldn't pay the price that you just want to move the curriculum the way you want to move, the way you want to teach, and you just wanted to cover those 180 days by dividing the curriculum into different months and weeks and days, and say, this is how I'm going to cover it. But in between, there are children who can excel. So you wanted to use a certain methods, and that's where this child psychologists are coming in, providing support. Let's talk about differentiation. Differentiation is defined as teaching process by which all students are accommodated to give them all the best chance to learn, right? In other words, by practicing differentiation, a teacher or teachers focuses on 3 aspects of students and further dividing these aspects into smaller sections. And what are they? These three aspects of differentiation are learning needs, readiness to learn, and interest. So you have the learning needs, readiness to learn, and I'll talk about it. How do we do that? Readiness to learn and in interest. And here are some of the aspects that I'll mention of differentiation that education can pay attention to, or perhaps they are paying attention to. Number one is pre-testing. One of the way is you wanted to differentiate, you want to do the pre-test, okay? So the pre-testing, if a teacher does pre-testing before they begin teaching, they could find out what students' needs are. I mean, where does the student actually stand in terms of challenging work, right? So number two is encouraging different styles of learning. Teachers should always get an idea of what a student wants to do, okay? And then allow them to work on their assignment in a way that reflects that. And number three is grouping. Some teachers find success in grouping children based on their abilities. So the experts says that it is the best for teachers to divide the class into three separate groups. Group one will follow the curriculum, normal trajectory. Group two will work beyond the trajectory, work beyond the normal curriculum. And the group three will be the group that require a little bit more assistance, right? So you have, in the past, 20 years ago, we used to call them below level, above level, and advanced. Now we have different names. There's a level where you have intervention. There are kids who are above average, and so on and so forth. So you can create these three groups and provide assistance based on that. However, they're all studying the same curriculum, right? If you're teaching pre-algebra, if you're teaching, let's say, something that has to do with grammar, for example, they're on the same curriculum, right? Perhaps on the same lesson plan that you have, but they all are working very differently. And I'll talk about it in the next slide. Teach in an open-ended manner, right? That's one thing we can do. It is important that the teachers teach in an open-ended manner, which means that assign students an assignment that is open-ended, right? More time for group work without specific goal in mind, okay? An assignment without a model, right? This will give high intelligent children more of a challenge, right? They can think outside of the box, something you want to keep it open, so they're busy, they're working, they are, they're trying to get you the best possible answer. But as when they're working in a group, this could be very encouraging for them, that you're still kind of prompting them to find you best possible scenario. Number two is make it real. Too often, highly intelligent students are pushed to achieve a faster rate. That generally is the case. Smart child work faster, right? Such as, and then with that, they can skip a year or push them to do an assignment in a faster rate. Instead, this practice, this doing it fast, teachers should be giving student a real life situation or a problem to solve instead. Modeling the assignment on those from higher grade level is another way to utilize. So let's say you use next level of literature for the student that you're teaching who are somehow on a higher intelligence, which is make like real life scenarios. Number three is take it slow. When differentiation starts, and I think that's very important, even with high intelligent student, it is best to take it slow and introduce the concept one subject at a time, okay? Experts suggest beginning with the math or reading, and there is always something else to read and more math problems to master. So when you start with reading or math, just know that there are always, when you start the lesson with that, you will have always add more to it, okay? So in conclusion, everyone, educational psychology is relatively a new field, but research has shown that it is a significant one when it comes to learning. And by utilizing the findings of this research, teachers, parents, caregivers, they're able to create the best option for all students to learn. This concludes our module number 20. I wish you all the best for the rest of the day and the rest of the week and the rest of the 2022. We'll see you on the next time, next slide, next module, which is going to be the module number 21. And that would be the last module for this entire course of child psychology. We will do a ceremony at the end, perhaps, and we'll take it one step at a time. Have a wonderful rest of the day.